Hello makers. Today I'm here to show you how I made these cards with the Stampers Anonymous 2025 Christmas Curations. Wasn't exactly sure which stamp sets I was going to be using except for this one. This is the Classics 10 from Stampers Anonymous, and I want to use the tag, maybe the greenery and some things from this set. And then I reached for a couple of the mixed media sets. This one is the Vintage Tidings set. This one is the Snarky Cats Christmas. I love the Snarky Cats. And then this one is the Sketch Greenery mixed media set. And so I want one that will fit on the tag, and I wasn't sure which of these I was going to use, so I just pulled all three. Now I started with some mixed media heavy stock and my Distress Archival ink in ground espresso, and I just started stamping the tag, and I stamped it about 6 times, maybe 8 times. I wanted to be sure I had plenty of tags, and you may notice that the little bit of string sometimes is going off the edge of the paper, and that is not anything I'm worried about. I knew I was going to be fussy cutting these out, and I was going to be cutting that string off. So I once I had them stamped, I wanted to color them a little bit, so I sprayed some water on them, and then I have some old paper distress spray stain, and I'm getting a little bit more color on those. This is where the archival ink that I stamped the tags in comes in handy because it is not water reactive like regular distress inks. So I can add my stains, water, whatever else, and it's not going to run. So that's why I stamped them in the archival ink instead of distress. So once I got this little bit of stain on there, I dried it. And now I have chosen the Sketch Greenery. It was the one that fit best on this tiny tag. And I inked up the stamps, and then I realized there is a kind of a coating left over from manufacturing. So I had to rub that off with my Inky Binky, and then I stamped it. So to stamp these, what I did was once I put the stamp on, I wiped off any of that leftover residual stuff. I inked it up with my Distress ink, and then I gave it 1 or 2 sprays of water and then stamped it on the tag. So it's a little bit of a watercolor stamp. Now this next one that I'm going to do, I got too much water. I sprayed it and got a blob on there. So you can see when I pick it up, see how it wicked way too fast. And so I do end up going back and stamping that again. It ends up not being too bad in the end, but it wasn't one that I put on the cards that I sent to Stampers Anonymous. And then you saw that I missed the middle part of that. That's the beauty of the clear stamps. I just laid it back down, kind of lined it up and stamped it again. Um, and you can't tell. Now, this is the one I stamped it perfectly. So I didn't get it too wet. But again, I used all of them, even the one I double stamped. Um, And now I want to add a little bit of color. So I have some Shabby Shutters Distress ink and some Fired Brick Distress ink. Put those on my media mat, and then I'm going to pick it up with a water brush. And on 3 of them, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of color in the leaves with the Shabby Shutters, just to add a little bit of color on those. And so it's this one, which is the open leaf one that I stamped correctly, and then the one above it where I got it a little bit too wet. But again, once I colored those in, really, as you can see, it didn't make much of a difference. Now, this is the only one that I added a little bit of red to for those berries. The rest of them didn't have any red, so I just need a little bit for the one. All right, now I'm going to make my backgrounds for my cards. So I'm going to use my stencil that has the 2 different stencil patterns. And it took me a while to get that plaid lined up there so I could continue it down to the bottom of the card. Now this, I just sprayed some water there on the ink, the oxide that was still on the stencil, and I am just stamping down with the stencil for a secondary little bit of a pattern. So that's kind of the opposite of the other plaid. And it's very light. I'm going to be using those though. So now I am using forest moss and fired brick distressed oxides to do this. The oxides are a pigment ink. And so, as opposed to the distress inks, which are a dye-based ink, the distress inks on the craft stock will show up, but the color is really affected by the craft color underneath. Whereas the oxides, because they're a pigment, the color shows through much better. It sits on top of the craft stock. So you can see that forest moss green is really rich on the craft stock. And so I just continued doing that where I would go ahead and blend through the stencil and then I would spray water on it and use it as a stamp on the other piece. So I did that in both colors for both of the stencil patterns. And you can see on this pattern that I was able to do the whole front of the card. It was easy to line up. And I decided I wanted this stamp version to be a little darker, so I added some more oxide before I wet it and then stamped it on the paper. Okay, so let's take a look at what I have. You can see that I have the dark stenciled version of each of the stencils and then the lighter stamped version of each in both the green and the red. And now I need to make my card bases. So I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 11-inch cardstock, and I am going to make this into an A2 card. So from the left-hand side, I'm going to score it at 3 1/2. And so now I have a flap that is a 3 1/2 by 4 1/4 inches. And I want to really burnish that score side down because you want to fold it over and then put the folded side up against the edge and go all the way over to 5 1/2 and score it at 5 1/2. And now you have a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch A2 card base. All right. So now fold that 2 inch flap over and it should meet up with your 3 1/2 inch flap. And there you have your A2 card with the fold offset just a little bit. All right, let's cover those flaps. So the bigger flap again, 3 1/2 by 4 1/4 inches. So I want to cut my stenciled pieces, the darker stenciled pieces, at 4 inches by 3 1/4. So I took all four of my stenciled pieces, the darker ones, and I cut those at 3 1/4 by 4 inches, and then that will fit perfectly on the larger flap. Now for the smaller flap, the 2 inch flap, I cut my pieces at 1 3/4 by 4 inches, and then that fits on the smaller flap. Once I had those pieces all cut, I started to place them on the card fronts and then decide which matching smaller piece I was going to put on the smaller flaps. And then I decided to go around the edge of my card base with old paper distress ink and around the craft stenciled pieces with walnut stain distress ink, as well as I went around the edges of the tag with the walnut stain. And then I decided to go ahead and color in that reinforcer with the walnut stain and then add a little bit of detail with some speckles or some drips with the walnut stain and my water brush. And then I reached for this, it says brown paper packages, and it's on the Classics stamp set, this little bit of text. And so I am stamping it in a few places in pumice stone distress ink. So it's very light on the craft paper, but you can see it when you are, looking at it in person. And so I just stamped here and there on the fronts of all of my uh, stenciled pieces. I added some of this text in pumice stone. So I'm only showing you on the one card, but I did it on all of them. And then I kept that same text piece and I inked it up with old paper distress ink. And I went ahead and stamped it on the backs of all of those cards. So I just stamped over all of the stenciling and then little bits of walnut stain drips or speckles that I had on there. I just kept adding layers to some of these pieces. And you can see even that that was fairly subtle, but I really liked it. Then I got out frayed burlap distress ink, and I am stamping this little pine branch that is also on um, the classics number 10 stamp set that the tag is on. And I am doing the watercolor stamping with the distress ink and frayed burlap on both flap stenciled pieces in a couple of places. And again, this ends up being light, but it is just another layer, adding to that worn kind of old, I don't know, woodsy feel, I guess is what I was going for with these cards. So I did this again to all of the card fronts. So I only showed you a couple here, but I did it to all of the card fronts. So remember the string that I cut off? Well, I knew I had this Mayarts brown jute twine in my stash, so I cut some pieces and I just put them through the reinforcer ends of the tag. So those are ready to go. And then my card bases are inked and ready to go. The covers for both of the flaps are all stamped. Look at all those layers of the different stamping, the stenciling, and all of that. And then, as you can see, I did stitch around each piece with brown thread. And I also stamped some sentiments from the Sketch Greenery stamp set, and I stamped those in the same oxides that I was using earlier. I've got my glue, I've got my foam squares, and I am ready to start assembling. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit so that you don't have to watch me assemble in slow motion. But the thinner pieces go on that 2-inch tab, and then the larger pieces are going to go on the 3.5-inch tab. And then I want to pop up the tags. So I put a few foam squares on each tag. And I did every one of these 4 cards the same way here. I put a little drop of glue on the back of those. And then I popped that up most pretty much in the center of that flap. And then I put just one square because I put it off center. I didn't center it on there. I put it kind of to the side. I went ahead and tied a knot in the bottom of the pieces of jute so that it was just kind of one piece, trimmed off any excess, and then just kind of put it down toward one side, and I did end up gluing that in place. And here's what they ended up looking like. So you can see I did go ahead and glue that string in place so it wasn't flopping around. But these are kind of the side fold cards. And you can see how the watercolor stamping on the background and on the tags just gave it that rustic look. I really like the craft paper, the layers, um, all of the little details that when I was doing it, it might have seemed like overkill, but it just all adds to, the cohesiveness of the card and how it all kind of pulled together there in the end. So I love the rustic wilderness feel of these cards. Well, I want to thank you for watching today. This one's longer than the last two because I actually had some video footage to show you. So as always, I want to thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments below. I have stills on my blog for you to look at if you would like. All of the details for the products that I used for these cards are in the description for today's video as well. And with that, I want to wish you a very creative day.